Hi, it's me, the storyteller. Thank you for joining me. Most of my stories on this channel are based on actual events, and some aren't. I'll let you decide if this story is fiction, or if it's not. At first, it looked like something had gone wrong with the city itself. Police lights flooded downtown Miami. Not one street, not one block, everywhere. People filmed from balconies, from sidewalks, from inside cars, stalled in traffic. Sirens layered until they became a single continuous sound. There had been celebrations just hours earlier. Fireworks, music, crowds spilling into the streets. The city was still awake, still loud, still unfinished with the night. And then it turned. Roads closed. Officers ran past storefronts. Helicopters circled overhead. No warning. For a long stretch of time, no one could say what had happened inside a popular shopping area. Only that it began on the first night of the year. January 1st, 2024. And whatever it was, the response didn't resemble anything most people had seen before. The videos were messy in the way real moments always were. Shaky hands, blown out highlights, voices colliding. But even through the compression and distance, one thing came through cleanly. Miami was moving. This wasn't the slow drift of a holiday crowd heading toward cars and hotels. It was the collective shift that happened when a place decided, without a plan, that it was time to leave. People turned in the same direction. They walked fast, then faster. Some ran. Some kept looking back as if whatever started behind them might follow. Threaded through everything, like a pulse you could almost count, were the lights. Red, blue, white. They flashed off windshields and glass towers, off storefront windows and polished pavement. The streets didn't look festive anymore. They looked operational, like the city had been rearranged in real time. From a distance, someone on a balcony, or someone scrolling at home, the instinct was immediate. This had to be serious. The kind of incident that flips a city from routine to emergency, because the police weren't arriving in ones and twos. They came in lines, cruisers angled into intersections, SUVs rolled into place. The strobes were so bright it was hard to tell how many vehicles there were, only that the number kept growing. Cameras panned and caught more arriving from another street, then another. At some point, it stopped looking like a response and started looking like a deployment. What unsettled people wasn't that Miami had police. It was everything that didn't accompany them. No clear explanation carried across the videos. Nothing people could point to and say, "This is why." Clip after clip held the same atmosphere. Sirens, confused shouting, and the thin, nervous energy of people trying to understand a situation while it was still changing. New Year's in Miami was never subtle. The air still held the residue of fireworks. The night should have tapered into morning in loose waves, people lingering, laughing, heading home. Instead, it snapped. And when the location surfaced, it made the scene feel even stranger. It wasn't a remote highway or a quiet neighborhood. It was Bayside Marketplace, a waterfront shopping and entertainment complex where crowds were normal and noise was expected. That detail mattered because it narrowed the possibilities instantly. It was too public to stay contained. Within minutes, the first accounts began circulating. They didn't sound supernatural. They sounded like panic. People described groups running, loud noises, officers pushing crowds back and clearing space. Some mentioned fights. Some said teenagers were involved. If that had been the entire story, it might have faded by morning. But the response kept nagging at people. Fireworks on New Year's weren't rare. Neither were brawls or chaos. None of that typically triggered a spectacle that looked like an entire section of the city was being locked down. So the next layer of the story didn't begin with evidence. It began with a question. What would bring this many officers? Numbers started flying immediately, rounded, exaggerated, simplified into something that felt true even when it wasn't precise. People claimed 200 cops. Others counted what they could see and doubled it. Some argued back that holidays increased staffing and the clips were misleading. But the footage kept circulating. Lines of vehicles, lights washing the streets, a sense of urgency that didn't shrink with time. The videos stopped being about what happened at Bayside and became about how Miami reacted to it, like the mystery wasn't the incident, but the posture. Then the rumor arrived that changed everything. It seeped in from different directions. Someone saying they heard something, someone saying they saw something, someone else filling the gap with certainty. People started saying there were beings. It shifted the tone from disorder to the uncanny. It gave the unease a shape. And because it was such an extreme claim, it spread the way extreme claims always did. Fast, polarizing, hard to kill. Some dismissed it immediately. They called it attention-seeking, the internet doing what it always did, turning noise into myth. Others leaned in, insisting they'd seen tall silhouettes moving through the chaos. They pointed to blurry frames and slowed down clips as if the truth could be extracted from pixels like a fossil from rock. Within hours, the story split in two. One version was what officials would later describe: teenagers, fireworks, panic, and a heavy police response meant to contain a situation that started to spiral. The other version treated those details as cover, distraction, misdirection, a neat explanation wrapped around something else. Both versions fed off the same raw material, the same lights, the same sirens, the same confused movement of people, fleeing a place they couldn't quite explain. It felt like the kind of event that should have a clean narrative, a beginning, a cause, an end. Instead, it became a foggy shape in the public mind, defined more by atmosphere than confirmed detail. Not because there was clear evidence of something impossible, because the ordinary explanation didn't seal the cracks the way people expected it to. Even if you believed it was fireworks, and it may have been, there was still the question underneath. Why did it feel like more? Why did it look like more? Why did so many people, watching the same night unfold, come away with the sense that something had briefly bent the normal rules of how cities behave? By the next day, the messaging began to harden. Reports stabilized. A simple explanation took shape and settled into place. But the internet didn't move on. Not when the footage was this vivid. Not when the emotional residue was this strong. For some people, the story stopped being about fireworks at all. It became about a moment when a public place in a major American city briefly felt swallowed by something no one wanted to name. And that was why, 2 years later, it kept resurfacing. Not because everyone believed the same theory, because no one could agree on what they witnessed. And in the age of cameras and instant narration, disagreement wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning. By morning, the night had already been translated into something official. News outlets reported it with familiar caution. A disturbance, panic, a police response, cause unknown at first, then clarified. Fireworks. Authorities said teenagers had set them off inside or near the marketplace. The sudden cracks caused confusion. People mistook the sound for gunfire. The crowd reacted the way crowds often did, surging, running, amplifying fear faster than facts could catch up. On paper, it made sense. Fireworks echoed unpredictably between buildings. In a dense space, they could trigger exactly the panic seen in the videos. Miami had dealt with similar chaos before, especially on holidays when large groups gathered and nerves were already high. Arrests were reported. Juveniles were involved. The situation, officials said, had been contained quickly. For many people, that was enough. They filed it away as another example of how quickly the internet could turn a messy event into something monstrous. But for others, the official narrative didn't close the loop. It explained panic. It didn't explain posture. When people rewatched the footage, this time less like witnesses and more like analysts, they started noticing details that hadn't registered in the moment. Coordinated movement, intersections locked down, areas cleared aggressively instead of simply evacuated. Dispersal looked one way. Containment looked another. And the footage seemed to hover between the two. Videos taken later showed continued police presence, continued closures, continued reinforcement moving toward the center. The situation looked stabilized, but the posture didn't relax. That didn't prove something extraordinary. It did suggest the simple explanation wasn't doing all the work people expected it to. As the day progressed, statements became more uniform. No threat to the public, no active shooter, nothing out of the ordinary to investigate. And yet, reassurance worked best when it matched what people believed they'd seen. Here, the images felt larger than the explanation attached to them. It wasn't that people wanted a mystery. The footage had already given them one. They didn't insist on aliens or conspiracies. They just said it felt off. They asked why the explanation arrived so quickly, with so few specifics. Why clear footage of the fireworks itself didn't circulate with the same intensity as the police response. Why so many recordings showed overwhelming presence from different angles across a wide area. Most of all, they asked why the story needed to be closed so firmly, so fast. If it were truly nothing more than fireworks and teenagers, the footage should have faded within a day or two. Instead, it lingered. Clips were reposted, comment sections refilled. New viewers found the videos without context and experienced the confusion all over again. Each time the same pattern repeated: disbelief, unease, then speculation. Not because there was proof of something extraordinary, because the ordinary explanation felt thin in places where it should have been solid. That thinness left room for imagination, room for the human tendency to look at disorder and wonder whether it briefly exposed something hidden. Later, additional details would be claimed. Some would be debated. Some would flare up and vanish again. But at this stage, the story was still trying to decide what it was. A holiday disturbance that spiraled out of control, or a moment in a shopping district on the first night of the year when the city behaved as if it couldn't afford to be wrong. The question people kept circling wasn't what caused the panic. It was how Miami reacted. As clips were replayed and slowed down, viewers stopped watching the crowd and started watching the police, compared angles and timestamps, trying to understand how one disturbance could ripple outward so aggressively. Most people had a picture of crowd control, localized, loud, designed to separate and disperse. What happened at Bayside looked different. Intersections beyond the immediate area were shut down. In several videos, officers moved toward the marketplace long after crowds had already thinned. If the danger had passed, why reinforce the center? If it hadn't, why speak like it had? Large cities sometimes overcorrect. Police departments sometimes flood a scene when early reports are incomplete. New Year's meant heightened alert, but it didn't erase the visual language of the response. It read as defensive. Early on, people said the police were everywhere. Later, they began saying the city was being locked down. Lockdown implied something more than dispersal, and the footage kept complicating the usual explanations. In some clips, the crowd was gone and the police remained. In others, vehicles continued arriving even as the visible chaos diminished. The city didn't look like it was winding down. It looked like it was holding its breath. This was where the story shifted, from incident to interpretation. People began asking what the police thought was happening in those first minutes, before the official explanation settled into place. Whatever came in early would have dictated everything that followed. And whatever it was, it prompted a response heavier than the public was later told to imagine. Some viewers compared it to responses they'd seen during high-threat events, active shooter alerts, large security mobilizations. The resemblance wasn't exact, but it was close enough to feel unsettling. Then attention drifted upward. Early on, it was easy to miss, a low thrum behind sirens and shouting. But once noticed, it was hard to unhear. Helicopters weren't unusual in Miami. News choppers, police aviation, tourist flights, normal on a night like New Year's. But viewers began asking what kind of helicopters these were. Some claimed they saw dark silhouettes moving lower than expected. Others said the sound didn't match what they were used to. A few videos were reposted with captions suggesting military-style aircraft. The claims were brushed aside, then argued over, then, quietly, stopped being mentioned. That fade out became its own kind of signal. The aerial component was neither confirmed nor clearly dismissed. It simply disappeared from the official conversation. And in stories defined by scale and silence, missing details pulled focus. Helicopters didn't prove anything on their own, but they suggested coordination beyond routine crowd management. Ground units handled dispersal, air units monitored scope, and scope implied uncertainty. Over the next days, the online argument hardened into familiar grooves. Skeptics citing pattern hunting. Believers insisting authorities wouldn't admit what they couldn't explain. Both sides talked past each other. Beneath it all was a quieter unease. Even stripped of supernatural claims, the response remained hard to reconcile. Cities liked resolution. They liked incidents that could be labeled, filed, and closed. This one resisted. The explanation arrived quickly. The scale of the response stayed fixed in memory, refusing to shrink down to match the story that followed. For a growing number of people, that disconnect became the real mystery. Not monsters, not deception. A moment when a modern city reacted as if something unpredictable had entered the system, then insisted almost immediately that nothing unusual had happened at all. That tension between reaction and reassurance was where imagination began to stretch. And once imagination had space, it didn't respect boundaries. Long before theories hardened into camps, something quieter was happening. People were comparing notes, not in headlines, but in comment threads and half-finished sentences carrying the same subtext. I don't know what it was, but I know what it felt like. Most accounts began with hesitation. People said they didn't get a clear look. It happened fast. The lighting was bad. The crowd was moving. Then they described what stuck. Large shapes, tall silhouettes, movement that didn't register as fully human. These weren't declarations. They were impressions left behind after adrenaline drained away. That detail mattered. Hoaxes tended to sound confident. This sounded uncertain. People described shadows, moving against light sources in ways they couldn't track. Forms that seemed to pass between structures instead of around them. The uncanny feeling of seeing something without being able to categorize it fast enough for the brain to relax. None of this required anything impossible. Human perception under stress was unreliable. In chaotic environments, the brain guessed. It stitched partial information into something that felt complete. Dark uniforms, broken sight lines, smoke residue, emergency lights pulsing at irregular intervals. All of it could distort scale and movement. A group moving in formation could briefly read as one tall figure. Someone sprinting through strobing light could seem to vanish and reappear. A shadow cast at the wrong angle could feel intentional. What made this incident different wasn't confusion. It was similarity. Across platforms, similar phrases kept surfacing. Too tall. Didn't look like a person. Those phrases weren't evidence. They were emotional fingerprints. And once the word beings entered the conversation, it acted like a magnet. The word was vague enough to cover anything and sharp enough to feel alarming. It didn't specify alien or monster. It simply implied, not us. That ambiguity gave people language to revisit their own fear. It also gave viewers a lens, one that changed how footage was watched. Videos were replayed with intent, frame-by-frame analysis, circles and arrows, shadows highlighted behind storefronts, between police vehicles, at the edge of the frame. Some clips revealed nothing at all, once stripped of expectation. Others stayed stubbornly unclear, and ambiguity, once noticed, expanded. Skeptics pushed back. They pointed to pareidolia, stress, suggestion, narrative hunger. They weren't wrong. But neither were the people who insisted the fear had been real, even if the interpretation wasn't. Fear didn't need accuracy to leave a mark. For those who were there, the night felt heavier, like the city briefly shifted into a posture meant for something unknown. Official explanations didn't overwrite that feeling. They sat beside it. Cameras were supposed to clarify reality. Here, they multiplied it. One person saw chaos, another saw control. Replay didn't collapse those perspectives into consensus. As days passed, the most extreme claims rose to the surface, not because they were most common, but because they were most memorable. The quieter accounts were buried beneath the louder ones. But beneath everything was the same foundation: fear, context failure, a crowd reacting before understanding. The mind reached for narrative. And once a narrative existed, it reshaped memory retroactively. People remembered more. Others questioned what they might have missed. The line between observation and interpretation blurred. That blur didn't prove something impossible had occurred. It did move the story into a different category. Less about what happened at Bayside, more about what happens inside people. When the systems that interpret reality, authority, footage, explanation, fail to converge into one clean truth. And once convergence failed, imagination didn't rush in. It crept. Over time, the story solidified, not as fact, but as felt truth. For skeptics, this was enough. Psychology, optics, architecture, stress, expectation. Nothing extraordinary required. The police response could be explained as overcorrection to incomplete information. The eyewitness accounts could be explained as perception under pressure. The lingering unease could be explained as a frightening moment that never fully resolved. Case closed. Except one problem remained: the posture. Logical explanations explained how people might misinterpret shadows. They didn't fully explain why the city reacted as if it couldn't afford to be wrong. That gap kept the door open, just enough. Because sometimes the unsettling stories weren't the ones that defied reason. They were the ones that almost fit, and almost was never enough to quiet the mind. That was when speculation shifted from impulsive to careful. By now, most people still engaging with the Bayside incident had already rejected the loudest extremes. They accepted that fear and perception could distort reality. But they weren't satisfied with explanations that ended at human error, because something lingered beneath it all, a sense that the response had been shaped by uncertainty. This was where the helicopter reports returned, not as headlines, as residue. Old comments resurfaced, clips were reposted, side-by-side comparisons appeared without commentary. People pointed out the sound again, the low, persistent thrum that didn't match sirens or traffic. Others shared videos from farther away, where the ground scene was reduced to light patterns and the sky became the focus. Some claimed they saw aircraft moving in wide arcs over downtown, not the hover and film behavior of news choppers, not the tight loops people associated with police aviation. No confirmed evidence established that military helicopters were officially deployed over Bayside that night. Speculation didn't have to jump straight to non-human conclusions. It could take a smaller step. What if, in the first minutes, authorities believed the situation was something else? What if the early reports weren't fireworks, but something unknown, miscommunicated, or unverified? In that scenario, overwhelming force wouldn't signal panic, it would signal caution. Cities didn't wait for certainty. They responded to possibility. And in the first moments of a chaotic event, possibility could look exactly like danger. From that perspective, the posture made sense. Not because something extraordinary was confirmed, because it couldn't be ruled out yet. Once certainty returned, once fireworks and juveniles became the dominant explanation, the response could be reframed without revisiting the uncertainty that shaped it. Still, for some people, even that didn't fully close the loop, because it didn't explain why eyewitness impressions leaned so consistently toward the unfamiliar, why people described shapes instead of individuals, why the fear felt directional, aimed at something unseen. This was where the stretch became uncomfortable, not because it demanded belief in aliens or monsters, because it exposed a gap between institutional behavior and public understanding. People wondered whether beings described biology or behavior. Figures that didn't flee, didn't shout, didn't match the emotional rhythm of the crowd. Sometimes closure offered too fast created suspicion instead of relief. And once suspicion took root, it didn't need proof to survive. It needed only the sense that something had been glossed over, because cities preferred order to ambiguity. And ambiguity was exactly what this incident refused to give up. By the time the incident slipped out of the news cycle, Miami had moved on, streets reopened, new stories replaced old ones. January turned into February, and the first night of the year became another date on a calendar. Officially, the case was closed. But stories didn't end when officials stopped talking. They ended when people stopped thinking. And this one never quite reached that point. It lingered in the background of the internet, resurfacing every few months like a half-remembered dream. New viewers found old footage. Older viewers rewatched it with fresh eyes. Comment sections filled again. What stayed consistent wasn't a single claim. It was the feeling, the sense that, for a brief window, the city reacted as if something unpredictable had entered the equation, then asked everyone to forget that reaction ever happened. For skeptics, the explanation remained sufficient. Human perception did the rest. For others, the explanation solved mechanics, but not mood. It didn't explain why the night felt heavier than similar events, why certain details, like the presence of aircraft or the scale of coordination, were never clearly addressed. In the end, the Miami Mall incident became less about what happened and more about how stories behaved now. Footage didn't guarantee clarity. Authority didn't guarantee closure. People didn't agree on what they saw. But many agreed on one thing. That night didn't feel normal. And maybe that was the most honest ending the story could have. Not every explanation replaced what people felt in the moment. Sometimes all that remained was footage, memory, and the space between them. On January 1st, 2024, something happened at a shopping complex in Miami. We were told what it was. Most people accepted that. Some didn't. And years later, the reason the story still resurfaced wasn't because anyone could prove something extraordinary. It was because, for a moment, a familiar place felt unfamiliar. And once that feeling took hold, it never fully let go. Not as proof, as a question. One that asked less about what we saw and more about how much certainty we really needed in order to move on. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to the channel. Give it a like, a comment, and maybe a share. But if you didn't like the story, maybe share it with someone you don't like. In any case, I'm glad you stuck around to the end.